scream came from the training field, before the sun had even finished rising, and Alira froze with a bundle of herbs still clutched in her hand. She knew that sound. It was the sound of someone about to make a terrible mistake in front of the entire pack. She should not have looked. She should have kept walking toward the healer's hut like she did every morning, eyes down, steps quiet, exactly the way she had trained herself to move for 8 long years. But something about the tone of that scream pulled her toward the fence at the edge of the field, and what she saw there made her chest go tight. Alpha King Draven had returned. He stood taller than she remembered, though she supposed 8 years could do that to a man. His shoulders looked carved from stone, and his eyes swept across the training grounds with the kind of authority that made even seasoned warriors straighten their spines. He was not shouting. He did not need to. His silence carried more weight than any command. Alira's stomach dropped. She had heard whispers 2 days ago that the king was expected back from the northern territories, but whispers were easy to dismiss. Seeing him standing there, very real and very much alive, was something else entirely. She turned quickly, pressing herself against the wooden fence post, and forced her breathing to slow. He would not recognize her. He had never truly looked at her, not once, not in the brief and humiliating ceremony 8 years ago, when she had been presented to him as his intended mate, and he had wrinkled his nose in open disgust at the idea of a broken, silent girl carrying his bloodline. That disgust had saved her life. She still remembered the exact words the elders had used to describe her back then, spoken as if she could not hear them, as if her supposed muteness meant she had also lost her hearing, and her mind. Damaged, useless, not fit for a king. She had listened to every insult with her jaw locked tight and her eyes fixed on the floor, and inside, she had felt something close to relief, because every insult pushed her further from a fate she had been dreading, since she was old enough to understand what being claimed by an alpha actually meant. She had heard the stories about Draven long before she ever stood in front of him. Stories of rival packs crushed without mercy. Stories of mates who vanished from pack life the moment they stopped being useful. Stories told in hushed voices by older women who would go quiet the second a man walked into the room. To a frightened 16-year-old girl, those stories had felt like a life sentence dressed up as an honor. So she had done the only thing she could think of. She stopped speaking. It began as a simple experiment, a way to buy herself time before the binding ceremony. But when the elders whispered about sending her away instead of forcing the bond, she understood exactly what she had stumbled onto. A voice was a symbol of worth in the world she had been born into. Take away the voice, and you take away the value. She let them believe she had lost the ability to speak from shock, from fear, from whatever explanation satisfied them enough to leave her alone. It had worked better than she ever imagined. Draven had taken one look at her trembling and silent form, and turned to his advisors with a single sentence that changed the entire course of her life. Find another arrangement. I have no use for a mate who cannot even speak her own name. He had walked away without a second glance, and Alira had spent 8 years grateful for every syllable of that rejection. Now, standing behind the fence with her heart hammering against her ribs, she reminded herself that nothing had changed. She was still the quiet healer's assistant nobody paid attention to. She still spent her days grinding herbs and setting bones, and tending to the small injuries of pack members too proud to complain about them. Draven had a kingdom to run, and enemies to worry about. He would not spare a single thought for the broken girl he had discarded before his own coronation. She almost believed it. Later that morning, she carried a basket of bandages toward the healer's hut, when Nora, the older woman who had trained her in herbal medicine for the better part of a decade, stopped her with a hand on her arm. You heard he is back, Nora said, her voice low even though no one stood near them. Alira nodded once, careful and slow, the way she always responded to questions that required an answer. He looks different, Nora continued, glancing toward the center of the pack grounds where a cluster of warriors had gathered. Harder. Colder than before, if that is even possible. Word says the northern campaign changed him. Some say it hardened something inside him that never softened back. Alira kept her expression carefully blank, though inside her mind raced through every possible meaning behind those words. A colder Draven was not necessarily a safer Draven. She had built her entire existence around the assumption that he had forgotten her completely, that she was nothing more than a footnote in his memory from a decade ago. If something had changed in him, if his priorities had shifted, she needed to know before it was too late to protect herself. "Do you think he will hold a formal gathering?" Nora asked, more to herself than to Alira, since kings usually did after long absences. "All the pack will be required to attend, even the ones who serve quietly in the back like you and me." Alira felt her stomach twist into a knot. A gathering meant standing in a crowd where the king's eyes would sweep across every face present. It meant being seen, even briefly, even from a distance. For 8 years she had avoided exactly that kind of exposure, choosing tasks that kept her in the healer's hut, or in the surrounding forest gathering supplies, always at the edges of pack life, rather than its center. She finished her work in silence, as she always did, letting her hands move through familiar motions, while her mind turned over every possible danger ahead of her. By the time the sun began sinking toward the horizon, word had spread through the entire territory exactly as Nora predicted. Alpha King Draven had called for every member of the pack to gather at the central hall the following evening. Attendance was not optional. Alira spent that night lying awake in her small room above the healer's hut, staring at the wooden beams of the ceiling and trying to convince herself that nothing would go wrong. She had survived 8 years of careful invisibility. She knew exactly how to stand in a crowd without drawing a single glance. She knew how to keep her eyes low, and her expression empty, and her body still, in a way that made people forget she existed at all. But there was a part of her, small and persistent, that remembered the way Draven's eyes had swept across the training field that morning. Sharp, assessing, the eyes of a man who noticed everything and forgot nothing, no matter how cold he pretended to be. She thought about leaving. The idea crossed her mind more than once during that long, sleepless night. She could gather a small bag of supplies, slip out through the eastern gate before dawn, and disappear into the wilderness beyond pack territory. She had learned enough about survival during her years working alongside Nora that she might actually manage it. But leaving carried its own risks. An unclaimed Omega traveling alone through contested lands was an easy target for rogue wolves and rival packs alike. At least within Draven's territory she had protection, even if that protection came from a man who did not know she existed. Leaving meant trading one danger for a dozen unknown ones. So she stayed. The following evening arrived faster than she wanted it to. She dressed in the same plain gray clothing she always wore, nothing that would catch attention, and walked toward the central hall, alongside dozens of other pack members making the same journey. The building glowed with torchlight, and the murmur of hundreds of voices rose into the evening air as everyone settled into position along the wide stone floor. Alira positioned herself near the back, half hidden behind a support beam, exactly the spot she had claimed for every gathering over the past 8 years. From there she could observe without being observed, listen without needing to speak, exist at the very edge of pack life where no one thought to look. A hush fell over the crowd as Draven entered. He moved through the hall with the same effortless authority she had noticed on the training field that morning, and up close, even from a distance, she could see exactly what Nora had meant about him looking different. There was a hardness in his features now that had not been there 8 years ago, a tightness around his jaw that suggested a man who had seen more than any person should have to witness. His eyes swept across the crowd as he took his place at the front of the hall, and for one terrifying second, Alira felt certain his gaze had paused directly on her hiding spot behind the support beam. Then he looked away, addressing the crowd with a brief announcement about the Northern Campaign and the strengthening of pack borders, and Alira released a breath she had not realized she was holding. It was nothing. A trick of her own frightened imagination. She had spent 8 years training herself to expect danger around every corner, and old habits made her see threats where none actually existed. The gathering continued for perhaps another hour, filled with updates about territory boundaries and supply arrangements that Alira barely registered. Her mind kept circling back to that single moment when Draven's gaze had swept past her hiding place, replaying it over and over, searching for meaning that probably was not there at all. When the gathering finally ended, and the crowd began dispersing into the cool night air, Alira allowed herself to relax slightly. She had survived it. She had stood in the same room as Alpha King Draven and remained completely invisible, exactly as she had done at every gathering for the past 8 years. Tomorrow she would return to her quiet routine of herbs and bandages and healing, and this brief moment of tension would fade into memory like everything else. She did not know, as she walked back toward the healer's hut beneath a sky full of distant stars, that Draven had in fact noticed something in that crowd. Not her face, not yet, not anything he could name or explain. Just a flicker of something familiar, a pull he could not account for, gone before he could even turn his head to search for its source. It would take him time to understand what that flicker meant. But time, as Alira would soon discover, was the one thing she no longer had in abundance. 3 days after the gathering, a young warrior named Cole arrived at the healer's hut with a deep cut along his forearm, the result of a careless training accident that had left him embarrassed as much as injured. Nora was away collecting supplies from the eastern forest, which left Alira alone to handle the wound. She worked quickly and efficiently, cleaning the cut with practiced hands before applying a mixture of herbs she had prepared weeks earlier for exactly this kind of injury. Cole watched her with quiet curiosity, the way most pack members did when they first encountered her silence. "You never talk," he said, eventually, not unkindly, just observing. "Nora says you have not spoken a single word since before I was old enough to remember you." Alira kept her eyes on the wound, wrapping a clean bandage around his forearm with careful precision. "Must be strange," he continued, "living your whole life without a voice. I do not think I could manage it. I would go mad within a week." She finished the bandage and offered him a small, polite smile, the kind she had perfected over years of similar conversations. It was the only response she ever needed to give. People filled silences with their own assumptions, and those assumptions almost always worked in her favor. Cole left with his arm properly bandaged, and his curiosity apparently satisfied, and Alira returned to organizing the herbal supplies along the wooden shelves that lined the hut's back wall. It was mindless work, the kind that let her thoughts wander freely, and inevitably, her mind drifted back to the gathering 3 nights earlier. She told herself repeatedly that nothing had changed. Draven had returned, made his announcements, and would soon become consumed by the endless demands of running a kingdom recovering from a long military campaign. He had no reason to think about her, no reason to even remember she existed within his territory. But a small, nagging doubt refused to fully quiet itself. Something about the way his eyes had swept across that crowd stayed with her, a memory she could not quite shake no matter how many times she tried reasoning it away. She did not yet know that Draven had already asked one of his advisors, almost offhandedly, about a quiet woman who worked at the healer's hut and had not spoken in years. She did not know that the advisor's brief and dismissive answer had somehow failed to satisfy him, or that he found himself thinking about that fleeting moment in the crowd more often than a king recently returned from war should have time to think about anything at all. For now, Alira continued her quiet life exactly as she had built it, one careful day at a time, unaware that the foundation beneath her feet had already begun, ever so slightly, to shift. Draven stood at the window of his private chamber, long after the gathering had ended, staring out at the dark shapes of the forest beyond the pack borders. Sleep would not come easily tonight, though he could not name the exact reason why. He had faced far greater troubles than a restless mind after a routine gathering. Rival packs, border skirmishes, the endless demands of rebuilding trust after a long absence. None of it should have kept him awake. And yet something did. He replayed the gathering in his mind, searching for the source of his unease. Nothing unusual had happened. The pack had listened to his announcements with the same respectful attention they always offered. No threats had surfaced. No disputes had erupted among the gathered crowd. Everything had proceeded exactly as it should have, except for that single moment near the back of the hall, when something had tugged at the edge of his awareness, like a scent carried on the wind, gone before he could turn his head to locate its source. He told himself it meant nothing. Perhaps exhaustion from the long campaign had finally caught up with him, playing tricks on senses that had been stretched too thin for too long. He had returned from the north only days ago, and the weight of command had not lightened even slightly since crossing back into his own territory. Still, sleep proved elusive, and when morning finally arrived, Draven summoned his closest advisor, a steady and loyal man named Ronan, who had served the pack for over 2 decades. "Tell me about the healer's hut," Draven said without preamble, as Ronan entered the chamber. Ronan blinked, clearly caught off guard by the request. "The healer's hut, my king? Is something wrong with the medical supplies?" "No." Draven turned from the window to face him directly. "I want to know who works there. All of them." Ronan considered the question for a moment before answering. "Nora oversees it, as she has for many years. Skilled with herbs and wounds alike. She has an assistant as well, a young woman who has worked alongside her for as long as I can recall." "What is her name?" Draven asked. "Alira." Ronan replied. Quiet sort. Keeps to herself mostly. Something in Draven's chest tightened at the sound of that name, though he could not have explained why if pressed. He kept his expression neutral, unwilling to reveal the strange pull he felt toward information that should have meant nothing to him. Quiet in what way? He asked. She does not speak, Ronan said. Has not for many years, from what I understand. Some kind of condition from her youth, though the details were never entirely clear to me. She communicates through gestures and expressions well enough that it rarely causes trouble. Draven absorbed this information in silence, turning it over in his mind. A woman who did not speak. It should have meant nothing to him, should have been forgotten the moment Ronan left the chamber, and yet the detail lodged itself somewhere deep and refused to loosen its grip. Has she always worked at the healer's hut? He asked. As long as I can remember, Ronan confirmed, though there was a hint of curiosity creeping into his own voice now. May I ask why the sudden interest, my king? Draven waved the question away with a slight motion of his hand. Curiosity only, nothing more. You may go. Ronan left without further questions, though Draven suspected the man's curiosity had only deepened rather than faded. He did not care. His own mind was too occupied with the strange sensation still lingering from the previous night's gathering, a sensation that had somehow attached itself to the mere mention of a silent woman he had never consciously noticed before. He tried to dismiss the entire matter as he moved through the rest of his morning duties, meeting with warriors to discuss border patrol schedules, and reviewing reports from scouts stationed near contested territory lines. The northern campaign had left several packs in the surrounding region unsettled, uncertain whether Draven's territory remained strong enough to deter opportunistic attacks, and much of his attention needed to focus on reinforcing that strength, rather than chasing strange feelings from a crowded hall. Yet by midday, he found himself walking in the general direction of the healer's hut, telling himself it was simply part of his routine inspection of pack facilities after his long absence. He needed to assess the state of every building and resource within his territory, and the healer's hut was no exception to that responsibility. It had nothing to do with the woman who worked there. He repeated that thought to himself several times as he approached the small wooden structure at the edge of the pack grounds, smoke curling gently from its chimney into the midday air. He could hear voices from inside, one belonging to an older woman he recognized as Nora from years past, and another silence, where a second voice should have been. He paused just outside the door, listening for a moment, before deciding his hesitation was unbecoming of a king, and stepping inside without announcement. Nora looked up from her work at a wooden table covered in dried herbs, her expression shifting quickly from surprise to formal respect as she recognized her visitor. "My king," she said, straightening immediately. "We were not expecting you." "I am conducting inspections of the pack facilities," Draven said, his eyes already moving past her toward the younger woman standing near the back shelves, her hands frozen mid-motion as she organized a row of small clay jars. This was Alira. She was smaller than he expected, though he could not have said what he had expected in the first place. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple braid, and her clothing was plain and practical, nothing that would draw attention in any setting. She kept her eyes lowered, her posture careful and still, exactly the way someone accustomed to remaining unnoticed would carry themselves. And yet the moment his gaze landed on her, that same strange pull from the previous night returned with startling intensity. Stronger now, that he stood only a few paces away, rather than across a crowded hall. Draven found himself unable to look away. "This is my assistant," Nora said, gesturing toward Alira with obvious pride. "She has worked alongside me for many years now. Skilled hands, careful mind. The pack owes her more gratitude than she ever receives." Alira offered a small, respectful bow in Draven's direction, though she still did not meet his eyes directly. Something about the careful control of that movement struck him as oddly familiar, though he could not place why. "Does she speak?" Draven asked, though he already knew the answer from Ronan's report earlier that morning. He wanted to hear it confirmed from someone who worked alongside her daily, wanted some reason to understand the strange reaction building in his chest. Nora's expression softened with something like sympathy. "She has not spoken in many years, my king, a condition from her youth, though she manages quite well without it. Her hands do more talking than most people's mouths ever could." Draven nodded slowly, his eyes still fixed on Alira, who remained perfectly still under his attention, her expression carefully neutral, in a way that suggested significant practice rather than natural composure. "Continue your work," he said finally, forcing himself to look away and address Nora instead. "I merely wish to see the state of the facility." He left shortly after, offering a few brief comments about supply levels that Nora answered with practiced ease, and stepped back out into the midday sunlight with his mind more unsettled than it had been in years. The pull he felt toward that quiet woman defied every explanation he could construct, and Draven was not a man accustomed to confusion of any kind. He walked back toward his own quarters at a measured pace, replaying the brief encounter over and over, searching for some logical thread that would explain the strange sensation. Perhaps it was simply the strangeness of her silence that intrigued him, an unusual trait in a pack where every other member spoke freely and often. Perhaps it was nothing more than curiosity about someone who had managed to remain almost entirely invisible within his own territory for years without his knowledge. He told himself these explanations were sufficient, and yet none of them fully satisfied the restless feeling that continued to linger in his chest long after he had returned to his duties. That evening, as Draven reviewed border reports alone in his chamber, his thoughts kept drifting back to the healer's hut, despite his best efforts to focus on more pressing matters. He found himself wondering what her voice might have sounded like before whatever condition took it from her. He found himself wondering what thoughts moved behind those carefully lowered eyes, what she truly felt beneath that practiced stillness. These were not thoughts a king reviewing border security reports should be entertaining, and Draven forced himself to set them aside, focusing instead on the maps spread across his table, and the careful calculations required to keep his territory safe from encroaching threats. But later, much later, as sleep finally began to claim him, one final thought surfaced before he drifted off entirely. He wanted to see her again. Meanwhile, back at the healer's hut, Alira had spent the remainder of the afternoon in a state of quiet, controlled panic that she refused to let show on her face. Nora had noticed nothing unusual in her behavior, continuing her work with the same easy confidence she always carried. But Alira's mind raced through every possible implication of Draven's unexpected visit. He had looked at her, really looked, in a way that felt different from the brief and dismissive glance he had spared her during their first and only previous encounter, 8 years earlier. She had felt the weight of his attention settle over her like something physical, and it had taken every ounce of her careful training to keep her expression neutral and her posture still beneath it. It could mean nothing, she told herself repeatedly, as she finished her tasks for the day. King's inspected pack facilities. It was a routine duty, nothing more. He had likely already forgotten the visit entirely, moving on to more important matters that actually deserved his attention. But some quiet, persistent part of her refused to fully believe that explanation, and as she walked back to her small room above the hut that evening, she found herself glancing over her shoulder more than once, as though some part of her expected to find him standing there, watching her with those sharp, assessing eyes that seemed to see far more than she wanted them to. For the first time in 8 years, Alira felt the careful walls she had built around her life beginning to show the faintest hint of cracks. A week passed before Draven found a reason to return to the healer's hut, though he told himself each day that his interest had faded, that the strange pull he felt during his first visit had simply been a passing curiosity born from exhaustion after a long campaign. He had far more pressing matters demanding his attention. Reports arrived daily about a rival pack called the Thornwood clan, testing the boundaries of his territory, small incursions that could easily escalate into something more serious if left unaddressed. And yet, when a training accident left him with a deep gash along his side during a sparring session with his second-in-command, Draven found himself walking toward the healer's hut instead of summoning one of the junior healers to his own quarters, as protocol would normally dictate. He told himself it was simply more efficient. Nora greeted him with visible alarm when he entered, immediately ushering him toward a wooden bench near the center of the hut. "My king, you are injured. Sit, please. Let me examine this immediately." "I require Alira," Draven said before he could stop himself, the words leaving his mouth with more certainty than he had intended. Nora paused, glancing toward her assistant with mild surprise before nodding. "Of course, my king. She has a gentle hand with wounds like this. Alira, please assist." Alira approached with careful, measured steps, her eyes fixed on the wound, rather than his face, as she knelt beside the bench to examine the injury. Draven watched her closely as she worked, noting the steady confidence in her movements despite her obvious youth. the way her fingers moved with practiced precision as she cleaned the wound and prepared a mixture of herbs to apply against the torn skin. Her hands are gentle, he observed quietly, more to himself than to either woman present. Illyra's fingers paused for the briefest moment before continuing their work, and Draven caught the small hesitation, filing it away without quite understanding why it seemed significant. She has always had a gift for this kind of work, Nora said, filling the silence that Illyra could not fill herself. Even as a young girl, she showed remarkable skill with herbs and healing. I count myself fortunate to have trained her. Draven kept his eyes on Illyra as she finished applying the herbal mixture and began wrapping a clean bandage around his side, her touch light and efficient, despite the awkward angle required to reach the wound properly. He noticed the way her jaw tightened slightly with concentration, the way her brow furrowed just enough to suggest deep focus rather than mere routine. It struck him as strange, watching her work in such careful silence, that someone capable of such precise and thoughtful movement would be dismissed as broken, or lesser, by those who judged her only by her missing voice. There was clearly a sharp mind operating behind those lowered eyes, a mind that noticed far more than her silence let on. "You have quite a talent," he said, as she finished the bandage, tying it off with careful, practiced knots. Illyra offered a small nod in acknowledgement, still avoiding direct eye contact, and stepped back to allow Nora to inspect her work. "Excellent as always," Nora said approvingly, before turning her attention back to Draven. "You should rest that side for several days, my king. The wound is not deep, but it will heal faster with proper care." Draven rose from the bench, testing the bandage with a slight movement of his torso, satisfied with its secure fit. "I will keep that in mind," he said, though his eyes remained fixed on Illyra rather than Nora as he spoke. He left the hut moments later, but the encounter stayed with him throughout the remainder of the day, replaying itself in his mind during meetings with his advisors, and during his review of the latest scouting reports concerning the Thornwood clan's movements along his territory's edges. He found himself distracted in ways he had not experienced in years, his focus repeatedly drawn back to the memory of careful hands, working against his skin, and eyes that refused to meet his own. That night, as he lay awake in his private chamber, Draven found himself analyzing his own reactions with the same careful scrutiny he applied to enemy strategy or border defense. Something about Illyra pulled at him, in a way he could not fully explain through ordinary curiosity alone. It felt deeper than that, more instinctive, as though some part of him recognized something in her that his conscious mind had not yet identified. He considered, briefly, the possibility that she might be connected to him through the bond all alphas eventually formed with a true mate. He dismissed the thought almost as quickly as it surfaced. He had been presented with his intended mate 8 years earlier during a formal ceremony. A silent and trembling girl who had been deemed unsuitable and sent away before any bond could properly form. He remembered almost nothing about that encounter beyond his own dismissive response to what the elders had described as a damaged, broken young woman. Surely fate would not present the same opportunity twice, especially not through a woman who worked quietly at the edges of his own pack without his knowledge for years. And yet the thought refused to fully leave him, lingering at the edges of his consciousness, even as sleep finally claimed him. The following days brought increasing pressure from the Thornwood clan's border incursions, forcing Draven to focus more intently on strengthening his territory's defenses. He spent long hours in meetings with his warriors, reviewing patrol routes and discussing strategies to deter further aggression from the rival pack. The distraction should have pushed thoughts of the silent healer from his mind entirely. It did not. He found himself asking Ronan subtle questions about her during quiet moments between meetings, gathering small pieces of information that painted a fuller picture of the woman he could not stop thinking about. She had joined the healer's hut as a young teenager, Ronan explained, though the exact circumstances of how she came to work there remained somewhat unclear, even to those who had known her for years. She kept almost entirely to herself outside of her healing duties, rarely socializing with other pack members, beyond brief, necessary interactions. It struck Draven as odd that someone could exist within his territory for so many years, while remaining almost entirely unknown to him, and the oddness of that fact only deepened his curiosity rather than satisfying it. Nearly 2 weeks after his second visit to the healer's hut, Draven found himself walking those same familiar paths again, this time under the pretense of checking on the healing progress of his earlier injury. He knew, even as he approached the small wooden structure, that his side had healed sufficiently and required no further attention. He walked there anyway. Elira was alone this time, Nora having departed earlier that morning to gather supplies from the surrounding forest. Draven found her organizing herbs along the wooden shelves, her back to the door as he entered, and for a moment he simply watched her work, unwilling to announce his presence and disturb the quiet, focused rhythm of her movements. She turned eventually, sensing his presence, and her eyes widened slightly with surprise, before she offered a respectful bow. "I came to check on the wound," he said, though both of them likely understood this was not entirely truthful given the amount of time that had passed since the original injury. Elira gestured for him to sit on the same wooden bench from before, and he complied, allowing her to inspect the mostly healed skin along his side with careful, professional fingers. Her touch remained gentle and precise, though Draven noticed a slight tension in her shoulders that had not been present during their previous encounters. "It is healing well," he offered, filling the silence himself since she could not. She nodded in agreement, stepping back once her inspection concluded. Draven remained seated for a moment longer than necessary, studying her face with the same careful attention he might apply to reading an opponent's strategy during a difficult negotiation. There was something in her eyes, he realized, something sharp and alert that seemed entirely at odds with the passive, broken image others in the pack had painted of her over the years. "You are not what I expected," he said finally, the words surprising even himself as they left his mouth. Elira's expression flickered with something he could not quite name, gone before he could fully identify it, but her composure returned quickly, and she offered only a small, polite bow in response, before turning back to her work along the shelves. Draven left the hut shortly after, more unsettled than he had been following either of his previous visits. Something about that brief flicker in her expression stayed with him throughout the remainder of the day, a small crack in her otherwise flawless composure that suggested far more complexity beneath her silence than anyone in the pack seemed to recognize. He did not yet understand what that complexity meant, or why it mattered so intensely to him, but he found himself determined, in a way that surprised his own careful, calculating mind, to uncover exactly what lay hidden behind those guarded, watchful eyes. News of increased Thornwood clan activity reached Draven early one morning, delivered by a breathless scout who had ridden through the night to report a gathering of enemy warriors near the eastern border. Draven called an immediate meeting with his senior advisors, the healer's hut and its quiet assistant, momentarily forgotten as the more urgent matter of territorial defense took priority. "They mean to test our strength," said Felix, one of his most trusted warriors, as the group gathered around a wide map spread across the central table in Draven's meeting chamber. "They know you have only recently returned from the north. They may believe our forces remain stretched thin from the campaign." "Let them believe what they wish," Draven replied, studying the map with narrowed eyes. "We will show them exactly how wrong that belief is." The following days brought a flurry of activity throughout the pack grounds, as warriors prepared for the possibility of open conflict along the eastern border. Draven personally oversaw much of the preparation, reviewing defensive positions and coordinating patrol schedules with the same intense focus he had once applied to conquering rival territories during his years of expansion. Despite the demanding pace of these preparations, thoughts of Elira continued to surface at unexpected moments, a persistent distraction that Draven found increasingly difficult to ignore. He caught himself wondering, during brief pauses between meetings, what she might be doing at that exact moment, whether she had heard about the growing tension with the Thornwood clan, whether such news frightened her the way it seemed to unsettle other members of the pack. He forced these thoughts aside repeatedly, reminding himself that a king facing potential conflict could not afford distractions of any kind, especially not distractions rooted in curiosity about a silent healer's assistant who likely posed no strategic importance whatsoever. And yet the pull remained, stubborn and persistent, refusing to fully release its grip on his attention no matter how urgently his duties demanded focus. 3 days into the heightened preparations, a border patrol returned with 2 injured warriors, their wounds serious enough to require immediate attention beyond what field treatment could provide. Draven accompanied them personally to the healer's hut, both out of genuine concern for his warriors and, if he was honest with himself, a quiet hope that the visit might offer another glimpse of Elira. Nora and Elira worked quickly upon their arrival, moving between the 2 injured men with practiced efficiency, Draven watched from a respectful distance as Alira tended to the more serious of the two injuries, a deep wound along the warrior's shoulder that required careful, steady hands to properly clean and treat. "She works well under pressure," Nora commented, noticing Draven's attention as she finished bandaging the second warrior's less severe injury. "Never rattled, no matter how serious the wound. I have seen experienced healers panic under less difficult circumstances." Draven nodded in agreement, his eyes still fixed on Alira as she finished treating the shoulder wound with careful, methodical movements. There was something almost hypnotic about watching her work, the quiet confidence in every motion, the complete absence of hesitation despite the seriousness of the injury before her. Once both warriors had been properly treated and moved to a quieter area of the hut to rest, Alira began cleaning her instruments, her movements slower now that the immediate crisis had passed. Draven approached her without quite deciding to do so, drawn by an impulse he did not fully understand. "You handled that well," he said quietly, careful to keep his tone respectful rather than presumptuous. Alira glanced up briefly, offering the same small, polite acknowledgement she always gave, before returning her attention to her instruments. Draven remained standing nearby, watching her work in silence for a long moment before speaking again. "Do you enjoy this work?" he asked, though he immediately recognized the strangeness of asking such a question to someone who could not verbally respond. Alira paused, considering the question with visible thought, before nodding slowly, her expression softening slightly in a way that suggested genuine feeling behind the simple gesture. "It shows," he said, "in your hands, in how careful you are with every movement." She looked up at him then, meeting his eyes directly for the first time since their earliest encounters, and Draven felt something shift in his chest at the unexpected directness of her gaze. There was intelligence there, sharp and watchful, along with something else he could not quite name, something that looked almost like caution mixed with curiosity. The moment lasted only a few seconds before she looked away again, returning her attention to her cleaning instruments, but it left Draven more certain than ever that the passive, broken image others held of her was fundamentally incomplete. He left the hut shortly after, his mind occupied with the strange complexity of the woman he had encountered, wondering what circumstances had truly led to her years of silence, and whether that silence hid more than a simple loss of voice. That evening, as tensions along the eastern border continued to escalate, Draven called another meeting with his senior advisors to finalize defensive strategies. Ronan arrived slightly late, apologizing for the delay before taking his seat at the table. "I noticed you visited the healer's hut again today," Ronan observed once the immediate business of the meeting had concluded, and the other advisors had departed, leaving only the two of them in the chamber. Draven did not immediately respond, weighing how much he wished to reveal about his growing preoccupation. "You seem quite interested in her," Ronan continued carefully, his tone respectful but probing. "I find her curious," Draven admitted eventually, choosing his words with deliberate care. "There is more to her than her silence suggests." Ronan considered this for a moment before speaking again. "If I may offer an observation, my king, there have always been strange rumors surrounding her arrival at the Pack all those years ago. Nothing concrete, mind you, but enough whispered speculation that some wondered whether her silence began before she joined us, or developed sometime after." Draven's attention sharpened immediately. "What kind of speculation?" he asked. Ronan shook his head slowly. "Nothing substantial enough to repeat with confidence, my king. Old rumors from years past, likely exaggerated through repetition over time. I only mention it because your curiosity seems genuine, and I thought you should know that her history carries some uncertainty within it." Draven absorbed this information in thoughtful silence, his mind already working through possible implications. If genuine uncertainty existed regarding when and how her silence began, it opened questions he had not previously considered, questions about whether her condition truly stemmed from some unfortunate accident of fate, or whether something more deliberate had shaped the circumstances of her arrival within his territory. He said nothing further to Ronan on the matter that evening, but the seed of doubt had been firmly planted, and Draven found himself unable to fully dismiss it as the night wore on. Something about Alira's story did not add up cleanly, and a king who had built his reputation on sharp instincts and careful observation was not inclined to ignore inconsistencies once he noticed them. Meanwhile, unaware of the growing suspicion forming in Draven's mind, Alira continued her work at the healer's hut, with the same careful routine she had maintained for years. She had noticed his increased visits with growing unease, each encounter leaving her more convinced that something had shifted in his attention toward her, though she could not fully understand why, or what it might mean for her carefully constructed safety. That direct eye contact earlier in the day had been a mistake, she realized as she prepared for sleep that evening. She had let her guard slip for just a moment, drawn by some instinct she could not fully explain, and the memory of his gaze holding hers left her feeling exposed in a way she had not experienced in years. She reminded herself, as she had many times before, that maintaining her careful facade required constant vigilance, especially now that the king himself seemed to be paying closer attention than she had ever anticipated. Every interaction needed to reinforce the same careful image she had built over 8 years, the image of a broken, silent woman, with nothing of interest hidden beneath her quiet exterior. But as she drifted toward an uneasy sleep that night, Elira could not shake the growing feeling that her carefully constructed world was beginning to shift in ways she could no longer fully control, and that the man responsible for that shift possessed exactly the kind of sharp, relentless mind that made hiding from him far more dangerous than hiding from anyone else within the pack. The eastern border grew quieter over the following week, the Thornwood clan's aggressive posturing softening into cautious observation rather than outright confrontation, though Draven remained convinced the calm was temporary at best. He kept patrols active and defenses reinforced, unwilling to let his guard down despite the apparent reduction in immediate threat. With the pressing military concerns easing slightly, his mind found more room to wander back toward the questions Ronan had raised about Elira's uncertain history. He found himself unable to simply let the matter rest, his natural instinct for uncovering hidden truths, refusing to accept vague rumors and unclear timelines without further investigation. He began, carefully and without drawing obvious attention, to gather more information about the exact circumstances surrounding Elira's arrival within the pack all those years ago. He spoke quietly with older pack members who might remember details from that time, framing his questions casually enough to avoid raising suspicion about his true motivations. An elderly woman named Grace, who had served as one of the pack's senior caretakers for decades, provided the most useful information during one such conversation. "I remember her arrival clearly," Grace said, settling into a chair near her small cottage, as Draven sat across from her, having framed his visit as a general check on the well-being of the pack's older members. "Such a striking young girl, though quiet even then. The elders spoke of matching her with you shortly after her arrival, if I recall correctly, though I believe there was some hesitation before the formal ceremony took place." "Hesitation regarding what?" Draven asked, careful to keep his tone conversational rather than urgent. Grace considered the question thoughtfully. "If I remember correctly, there were whispers that she had not always been silent. Some said the silence developed suddenly, right around the time discussions of her match with you began circulating among the pack elders. Others claimed she had simply been shy and reserved from the moment she arrived. I never knew which version held more truth." This confirmation of genuine uncertainty regarding the timeline of Elira's silence struck Draven with unexpected force. If her muteness had truly developed suddenly, coinciding precisely with discussions of their potential bond, the implication seemed almost too significant to ignore. He thanked Grace for her time and left shortly after, his mind working through the possibilities, with the same methodical focus he applied to military strategy. A woman who developed sudden, convenient silence at the exact moment she learned of an unwanted match with an Alpha King. It painted a picture that, once considered, seemed almost obvious in retrospect. But he needed more than rumors and uncertain memories to confirm such a significant possibility. He needed direct evidence, something concrete enough to either confirm or dispel the growing suspicion taking root in his mind. Over the following days, Draven began observing Elira with far greater attention than he had previously allowed himself, watching for any small inconsistency that might reveal the truth hidden beneath her careful silence. He visited the healer's hut more frequently, always under some reasonable pretense, studying her reactions and behaviors with the sharp, analytical focus that had made him such an effective military strategist. He noticed small things he had previously overlooked, the way her eyes occasionally flickered with quick understanding, during conversations she supposedly could not fully follow without spoken clarification, the way her breathing changed subtly during moments of tension, patterns that suggested active internal response, rather than the passive detachment one might expect from someone genuinely disconnected from verbal communication. During one visit, he deliberately tested a theory forming in his mind. He mentioned, in passing conversation with Nora, while Alira worked nearby preparing herbal remedies, a piece of information about renewed Thornwood clan movement along the border, speaking as though it were common, unremarkable knowledge, rather than a carefully guarded military detail. He watched Alira's hands from the corner of his eye as he spoke. They paused, almost imperceptibly, for just a fraction of a second before continuing their work. It was subtle. Most observers would have missed it entirely. But Draven had spent years training himself to notice exactly these kinds of small, telling reactions, and the pause confirmed something significant. She had understood the conversation, understood it well enough to react with genuine surprise at information that should have meant nothing to someone who could not properly follow spoken exchanges. His suspicion deepened further during a separate visit several days later, when a minor commotion arose outside the healer's hut, involving a young pack member who had wandered too close to a territory boundary marker during a game with other children. Someone called out a warning, sharp and urgent, and Draven watched as Alira's head snapped toward the sound, with immediate, unhesitating alertness, before she caught herself and forced her expression back into careful neutrality. The reaction time was too fast, too precise, for someone who claimed to have lost meaningful connection to spoken language years ago. It was the reaction of someone who understood every word being spoken around her with complete clarity. Draven said nothing about these observations to anyone, not even Ronan, choosing instead to continue his careful, patient investigation until he possessed enough evidence to confront the situation directly. He found himself both intrigued and unexpectedly frustrated by the growing certainty that Alira had deceived not just him, but the entire pack, for the better part of 8 years. And yet, despite the deception, he found his fascination with her only deepening rather than souring into anger. If his suspicions proved correct, it meant the woman working quietly at the healer's hut possessed remarkable intelligence, discipline, and resourcefulness, qualities that had allowed her to maintain an elaborate facade for nearly a decade without a single person within his territory uncovering the truth. It also meant, if his growing theory held any validity, that she had gone to such extraordinary lengths specifically to avoid becoming his mate. That realization settled uncomfortably in his chest, forcing him to consider questions about his own past behavior that he had never previously examined with any real scrutiny. He remembered, vaguely, the ceremony from 8 years earlier, remembered dismissing a trembling, silent girl with barely a second thought, focused entirely on his own ambitions and the demands of consolidating power across contested territories. Had his own reputation, built through years of ruthless expansion and unforgiving treatment of enemies, frightened a young woman so thoroughly that she chose to sacrifice her own voice rather than risk becoming bound to him. The thought unsettled him more than he expected, stirring something uncomfortably close to guilt, an emotion he rarely allowed himself to fully experience given the demands of his position. He resolved, as the evidence continued mounting in his mind, that he needed to confront the truth directly, rather than continuing his careful, indirect investigation. But he also recognized that such a confrontation required careful timing and consideration, given the potential consequences for a woman who had clearly gone to extraordinary lengths to protect herself from a fate she had once found unbearable. For now, he continued his patient observation, gathering additional confirmation of his suspicions, while simultaneously wrestling with the uncomfortable questions her deception raised about his own past actions and reputation within the pack. Alira, for her part, remained entirely unaware of exactly how close Draven had come to uncovering her carefully guarded secret. She noticed his increased visits and growing attention with mounting unease, sensing something had shifted in his behavior toward her, without fully understanding what had prompted the change. She found herself exercising even greater caution during his visits, deliberately slowing her reactions, and forcing additional delay into her responses to any sudden sounds or unexpected conversations, hoping to compensate for whatever subtle inconsistencies might have already revealed themselves without her knowledge. But some deep, instinctive part of her recognized that the careful walls she had built around her existence were beginning to crumble in ways she could not fully control, no matter how much additional caution she exercised. And as the days passed and Draven's visits continued with increasing frequency, that instinctive fear grew steadily stronger, whispering warnings she found increasingly difficult to ignore. The uneasy calm along the eastern border shattered less than 2 weeks later, when a scout arrived at the pack grounds with news that sent an immediate wave of alarm through Draven's inner circle. The Thornwood clan had not simply been testing boundaries with their earlier movements. They had been gathering intelligence, searching for a specific piece of information that had apparently reached their leadership through channels no one had yet identified. "They know about a hidden bloodline connection within our territory," the scout reported breathlessly, having ridden through most of the night to deliver the warning. "Their leader has been heard speaking of a mate connected to your line, my king. Someone they believe could be used as leverage against you should conflict escalate further." Draven's blood ran cold at the report, his mind immediately connecting the scout's words to his own growing suspicions about Alira. If the Thornwood clan had somehow learned of a hidden mate connection, someone they believed carried significance tied to his own bloodline, the danger extended far beyond simple military posturing. "How could they possibly know such a thing?" Felix asked, voicing the question weighing heavily on everyone present in the emergency meeting Draven had immediately called. "I do not know," Draven admitted, though his mind raced through possibilities. Perhaps old rumors from years past had somehow reached beyond his own territory, through channels he had never considered. Perhaps someone within his own pack had spoken carelessly to outsiders, unaware of the significance their words might carry. Regardless of the source, the implications were immediate and severe. If the Thornwood clan believed a hidden mate connected to Draven's bloodline existed somewhere within his territory, they would stop at nothing to locate and use that connection as leverage in whatever conflict they were planning to initiate. "We need to increase security throughout the pack grounds immediately," Draven said, his voice carrying the sharp authority that had made him such an effective leader during years of territorial expansion. "Every entrance, every boundary, every vulnerable point requires additional patrols. I want eyes on anything unusual, any strangers attempting to gather information within our territory." The meeting continued for another hour, coordinating logistics and defensive strategies, but Draven's mind remained partially occupied with a growing, urgent concern that had nothing to do with military tactics and everything to do with protecting one specific, unsuspecting woman working quietly at the healer's hut. If his suspicions about Alira held true, and the mounting evidence continued suggesting they did, she represented exactly the kind of vulnerability the Thornwood clan seemed intent on exploiting. A hidden mate, unclaimed and unprotected by any formal bond, existing quietly within his territory, without even the basic protections that an acknowledged connection would provide. He needed to act quickly, both to protect his territory from the growing military threat, and to ensure Alira's safety, before anyone outside his own pack discovered her true identity and significance. That evening, once the emergency meeting had concluded and immediate defensive measures had been set into motion, Draven made his way toward the healer's hut, with a sense of urgency he had not previously allowed himself to display during his visits. He found Alira alone, Nora having already retired for the evening, working quietly by candlelight to organize supplies for the following day. She looked up as he entered, her expression shifting quickly into the careful, neutral composure she always displayed in his presence, though Draven noticed a flicker of something like apprehension crossing her features before she fully composed herself. "I need to speak with you," he said, his tone more direct and serious than during any of his previous visits. Alira straightened slowly, her eyes searching his face with obvious wariness, though she said nothing, offering only her usual silent attention. "There is a threat building along our eastern border," Draven continued, watching her reaction carefully as he spoke. "A rival pack has learned something about a hidden connection within my own bloodline, someone they believe exists quietly within my territory. They intend to use this person as leverage against me, should conflict escalate." He watched her face closely as he spoke, searching for any reaction that might confirm or complicate his growing suspicions. Her expression remained carefully controlled, but he noticed her hands had gone still against the wooden table, no longer organizing the supplies she had been working with moments earlier. "I want you to understand something," he continued, taking a measured step closer. "Whatever protections this pack can offer, whatever security I can personally guarantee, extends to every member of my territory without exception. If anyone within these grounds has reason to fear becoming a target in this conflict, I need them to trust that I will protect them." Alira's eyes met his then, holding his gaze with an intensity that seemed to contradict everything about her supposedly passive, broken nature. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of unspoken understanding hanging heavily in the quiet space between them. Then she looked away, breaking the moment, and offered only a small, formal nod in response to his statement. Draven remained a moment longer, wanting to say more, wanting to voice the suspicions that had been building steadily over the past weeks, but something in her guarded expression convinced him the timing remained wrong for such a direct confrontation. Whatever truth existed beneath her careful silence, forcing it into the open now, amid growing external threats and heightened tension, seemed unlikely to produce the honest conversation he genuinely wanted. "I will ensure additional patrols remain near this hut specifically," he said instead, offering practical reassurance in place of the deeper conversation he wished he could have. "You and Nora should not hesitate to seek help immediately if anything unusual occurs." Elira nodded again, and Draven finally departed, leaving her alone with her racing thoughts and the growing certainty that her carefully protected secret existence had become far more precarious than she had ever anticipated. Once he had gone, Elira allowed herself a rare moment of visible distress, pressing her palms against the wooden table and closing her eyes as she processed everything he had revealed. A rival pack knew about a hidden mate connection. They believed someone existed within Draven's territory who could be used against him. They were talking about her. The realization settled over her with crushing weight. For 8 years, she had successfully avoided the danger she feared most, the danger of becoming bound to a man whose reputation for ruthlessness had terrified her since childhood. She had built an entire careful existence around avoiding exactly that fate. But now, entirely beyond her own control, a new and perhaps even more immediate danger had emerged, one that threatened not just her carefully constructed peace, but potentially her very safety. If the Thornwood clan somehow discovered her true identity and location, they would show her no mercy in using her as leverage against Draven, regardless of whether any formal bond actually existed between them. She spent that night in restless, anxious wakefulness, turning over every possible option available to her. She could continue exactly as she had for 8 years, maintaining her careful facade and hoping the external threat resolved itself without ever touching her directly. She could attempt to leave the territory entirely, seeking safety somewhere beyond both Draven's protection and the Thornwood clan's growing threat. Or she could finally reveal the truth she had hidden for so long, trusting that Draven's promise of protection extended genuinely to someone who had deceived him for the better part of a decade. None of these options felt entirely safe or certain, and as the night wore on toward dawn, Elira found herself further from any confident decision than she had been at any point during her carefully constructed existence within the pack. Outside, unbeknownst to her, additional patrols had already begun circling the perimeter of the healer's hut, exactly as Draven had promised. A quiet and watchful protection, extended toward a woman he suspected, but could not yet confirm, held far greater significance to his own life and safety than anyone else within his territory currently understood. 3 days after Draven's urgent warning at the healer's hut, the quiet tension along the eastern border finally broke into open chaos. It began just after midnight, when a coordinated group of Thornwood clan warriors breached a section of the boundary that had been left temporarily understaffed during a routine patrol rotation. By the time alarm horns sounded across the pack grounds, the intruders had already advanced dangerously close to the residential areas at the territory's edge. Elira woke to the sound of shouting and the distant blare of warning horns, her heart immediately racing as she scrambled from her bed and pulled on whatever clothing lay nearest. Outside her window, she could see distant flickers of torchlight moving rapidly across the grounds, along with the unmistakable sounds of a pack mobilizing for sudden, unexpected conflict. Nora appeared moments later, her own expression tight with alarm, as she gathered emergency supplies from the shelves lining the hut's walls. "We need to prepare for injuries," she said, her voice steady, despite the obvious tension in her movements. "Whatever is happening out there, wounded will be brought here soon enough." Elira nodded, and immediately began assisting, pulling bandages and herbal remedies into organized piles near the center of the hut, preparing for whatever chaos the night might bring. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency despite the fear tightening in her chest, years of training taking over even as her mind raced with uncertainty about the scale of the threat unfolding beyond the hut's walls. The first wounded warrior arrived within the hour, carried by 2 others who deposited him carefully onto one of the wooden benches before rushing back out to rejoin the ongoing conflict. Nora immediately began treating the injury, a deep wound along his leg that required urgent attention to stop the bleeding. More wounded followed in a steady stream over the following hours, and Alira worked alongside Nora with focused intensity, cleaning wounds and applying pressure and preparing herbal treatments as quickly as her hands could manage. The controlled chaos of treating injury after injury left little room for the fear that had gripped her earlier, replaced instead by the urgent, immediate demands of keeping each patient stable until they could receive further care. It was well past the deepest part of the night when the situation outside suddenly escalated further. A group of warriors burst through the hut's doorway, half carrying, half dragging a badly injured young warrior between them, his condition clearly critical based on the amount of blood soaking through makeshift bandages someone had hastily applied. "We need help immediately," one of them shouted, his voice raw with urgency and fear. Nora rushed forward to assess the injury, while Alira quickly gathered additional supplies. But even from a distance, she could see the wound required more than simple bandaging. A deep gash along the young warrior's abdomen had opened dangerously, and blood continued flowing at an alarming rate despite the pressure being applied. "We need to stop this bleeding now," Nora said urgently, her hands working quickly, but her voice betraying genuine concern about the severity of the injury. Alira moved to assist, applying additional pressure, exactly as Nora instructed. But even as they worked together, she could see the young warrior's condition continuing to deteriorate. His breathing had become shallow and rapid, his skin taking on a pale, concerning tone that suggested he was losing more blood than his body could safely tolerate. "We need someone to hold him steady while we work," Nora said, glancing around at the warriors who had carried him in, all of whom appeared uncertain how best to help in the chaotic, high-pressure situation. Before Alira could stop herself, before 8 years of careful, deliberate silence could reassert its familiar control over her instincts, urgent words tore from her throat with startling clarity. "Hold his shoulders down, now, before he moves and tears the wound further." The command left her mouth without conscious thought, born from years of medical training and the overwhelming urgency of the moment, and the effect on everyone present was immediate and profound. The warriors froze for a fraction of a second, staring at her with visible shock, before quickly complying with her instruction, pinning the injured young man's shoulders securely against the wooden bench. Nora's eyes widened with equal surprise, though she recovered quickly enough to continue focusing on the critical work of stopping the bleeding, trusting Alira's sudden intervention despite its startling nature. "Pressure here, directly on this point," Alira continued, her voice steady now despite the shock of her own words, guiding Nora's hands toward the exact source of the worst bleeding, with the confident authority of someone who understood precisely what needed to happen next. Together, they managed to stabilize the wound enough to slow the dangerous blood loss, working in tense, urgent silence, or what would have been silence had Alira's voice not continued offering occasional guidance throughout the remainder of the treatment. By the time the young warrior's condition had stabilized enough to allow a brief pause, the immediate crisis had passed, though the full weight of what had just occurred began settling over everyone present in the hut. Alira froze, realizing fully now what she had done. 8 years of careful, disciplined silence, broken in an instant of pure instinct during a moment of genuine crisis. She looked around at the warriors who had witnessed her speak, their expressions ranging from shock to confusion, and felt her stomach drop with the crushing weight of a secret suddenly, irreversibly exposed. Nora stared at her with wide, startled eyes, opening her mouth as though to ask a question, before seeming to think better of it given the chaotic circumstances still unfolding outside. "We need to move him to a safer area to continue recovery," Alira said quietly, her voice trembling now that the immediate urgency had passed, replaced by dawning awareness of what her momentary lapse might mean for everything she had carefully built over the past 8 years. The warriors complied, carrying the stabilized young man toward a quieter corner of the hut, their expressions still reflecting obvious surprise at what they had just witnessed. Alira knew, with sick certainty, that word of what had happened would spread quickly through the pack, once the immediate crisis of the attack had passed. She had no way of knowing, standing there in the aftermath of her own instinctive words, that someone else had also heard her speak. Draven had arrived at the healer's hut moments after the critical warrior had been carried inside, drawn by reports of the young man's severe condition and his own concern for the well-being of his forces during the chaotic conflict. He had entered quietly, unnoticed in the urgent flurry of activity surrounding the treatment, positioning himself near the doorway to observe, without interfering in the delicate medical work being performed. He had heard every word. The clear, confident command Alira had given, the steady authority in her voice as she guided Nora through the critical treatment, confirmed everything he had suspected over the past weeks, and more than he had ever expected to learn in such a sudden, dramatic fashion. He remained near the doorway, watching as the immediate crisis resolved, and the warriors carried the stabilized young man toward recovery, watching as Alira's expression shifted from urgent focus to dawning horror at what she had just revealed. She had not yet noticed him standing there, too consumed by the chaotic aftermath of the emergency to register his presence near the entrance. Draven found himself caught between several conflicting emotions as he watched her, understanding now with absolute certainty that his suspicions had been correct all along. She had spoken. She could speak, clearly and confidently, and had chosen to hide that ability for the better part of 8 years, deceiving an entire pack, deceiving him, all to avoid a fate she had apparently found unbearable. He should have felt anger at the deception, and some small part of him did. But a larger part of him felt something closer to grim understanding, recognizing that whatever had driven her to such extraordinary, sustained deception must have stemmed from genuine, deep-seated fear, rather than simple manipulation or dishonesty for its own sake. The conflict outside continued to rage, warriors moving urgently past the healer's hut as the fighting gradually pushed back toward the eastern border, but Draven remained frozen near the doorway, watching Alira as she finally seemed to notice his presence, her eyes widening with unmistakable panic as she registered exactly what he must have witnessed. For a long, tense moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of 8 years of carefully guarded secrecy hanging suspended in the space between them, ready to finally, irrevocably break apart. Alira stood frozen beside the recovery area, her eyes locked with Draven's across the chaotic hut, every carefully constructed defense she had built over 8 years crumbling in that single, terrible moment of recognition. He knew. There was no mistaking the certainty in his gaze, no possibility of pretending the words she had spoken moments earlier had gone unheard. The fighting outside gradually quieted as the night wore toward dawn, warriors pushing the Thornwood clan's forces back beyond the eastern border with the same determined ferocity that had made Draven's territory formidable for years. But inside the healer's hut, an entirely different kind of confrontation was only beginning. Nora, sensing the sudden tension despite her exhaustion from hours of continuous treatment, quietly ushered the remaining recovering warriors toward a separate section of the building, offering Alira and Draven the privacy that the gravity of the moment clearly demanded. "We need to speak," Draven said finally, his voice quiet, but carrying an authority that left no room for avoidance or delay. Alira nodded slowly, her hands trembling slightly at her sides, as she followed him toward a quieter corner of the hut, away from the recovering patients and any remaining pack members who might overhear their conversation. "You can speak," he said, once they stood alone, his tone measured despite the obvious weight of the accusation embedded within those simple words. "You have always been able to speak." Alira closed her eyes briefly, gathering whatever courage remained after the exhausting night, before opening them again to meet his steady gaze directly. "Yes," she said, her voice quiet but clear, the first deliberate words she had spoken aloud to another person in 8 years. The simple confirmation seemed to hang in the air between them, carrying the full weight of nearly a decade of careful deception finally, undeniably exposed. "Why?" Draven asked, and though his voice remained controlled, Alira could hear something raw beneath the careful composure, some genuine hurt or confusion that surprised her, given everything she had believed about his supposedly cold, unfeeling nature. She took a steadying breath before answering, understanding that whatever explanation she offered now would determine everything that followed. "I was afraid," she said simply. 8 years ago, when the elders told me I would be presented to you as a potential mate, I had already heard countless stories about your reputation. Stories of ruthlessness, of mates discarded once they stopped proving useful, of an alpha who showed mercy to no one who failed to meet his expectations. Draven's jaw tightened at her words, though he remained silent, allowing her to continue. "I was 16 years old," she continued, her voice growing steadier, as the words she had suppressed for so long finally found release. "I did not want to become bound to someone I believed capable of such cruelty. So when I realized how the elders viewed disability, how quickly they considered someone broken, or lesser, for simply lacking a voice, I understood I had found a way to escape a fate I found genuinely terrifying. You pretended to be mute, Draven said, his voice carefully neutral now, processing the full implications of her explanation. Yes, she confirmed, and it worked exactly as I hoped. You took one look at me and declared you had no use for a mate who could not even speak her own name. You walked away, and I have spent every day since grateful for that rejection. The silence that followed her words stretched long and heavy between them, Draven's expression difficult to read as he absorbed the full weight of her explanation. Alira watched him carefully, uncertain what reaction to expect, bracing herself for anger, or perhaps even genuine cruelty now that her deception had finally been exposed. Instead, when he finally spoke again, his voice carried something closer to quiet, troubled reflection rather than fury. 8 years, he said slowly. You built an entire life around silence, sacrificed your own voice for nearly a decade, because you feared what kind of man I might be. It was not an unreasonable fear, Alira said, surprising herself with the boldness of the response, though she found she could no longer hold back the honesty that 8 years of silence had suppressed. Everyone spoke of your ruthlessness, your conquests, the way you handled enemies, and even those within your own pack who failed to meet your standards. I was a frightened young girl, faced with the prospect of binding my entire future to a man I believed capable of treating me the same way. Draven's expression shifted, something like genuine discomfort crossing his features as her words settled over him. He remained silent for a long moment, seeming to wrestle with some internal reckoning that Alira could not fully interpret. I built that reputation deliberately, he admitted finally, his voice quieter now, less certain than she had ever heard it during any of their previous encounters. Years of consolidating power across contested territories required a certain image, a certain fearsome authority, that discouraged challenge from rival packs, and even from those within my own ranks who might otherwise question my leadership. He paused, running a hand through his hair in a gesture that struck Alira as unexpectedly human, entirely at odds with the cold, calculating king she had feared for so long. I never considered, he continued, that the same reputation I cultivated to protect my territory might also frighten an innocent young woman into sacrificing her own voice, rather than risk becoming my mate. Alira said nothing, uncertain how to respond to this unexpected admission, watching as Draven seemed to genuinely grapple with the implications of his own past actions, and the reputation he had so deliberately built over years of ruthless expansion. I am not proud of everything I did during those years, he admitted eventually, his voice carrying a rawness that suggested genuine vulnerability rather than practiced deflection. Conquest required hard choices, choices that likely earned me exactly the reputation you feared, but I never intended for that reputation to cause this kind of harm to someone within my own territory. The admission hung between them, and Alira found herself studying his face with new, unexpected attention, searching for the ruthless, unforgiving Alpha King she had built her entire existence around avoiding. Instead, she found something closer to genuine regret, a man confronting uncomfortable truths about his own past, with more honesty than she had ever expected from someone in his position. What happens now? She asked finally, her voice quiet but steady, bracing herself for whatever consequences her long deception might finally bring. Draven considered the question for a long moment before answering. I do not yet know, he admitted, but I know that whatever happens, it will not be built on the same fear and misunderstanding that shaped our first encounter 8 years ago. Alira felt something shift in her chest at his words, a small, cautious flicker of hope beginning to form, despite the overwhelming uncertainty of everything happening around her. The threat from the Thornwood clan remained unresolved, her secret now fully exposed to the one person she had spent 8 years hiding from. And yet something in Draven's careful, thoughtful response suggested the path forward might not be the immediate danger she had always feared. I need time to think through everything you have told me, Draven said finally, his voice returning to its usual measured authority, though something gentler remained beneath the surface. And you deserve time as well, time to decide what you want moving forward, now that the truth stands fully between us. He left the hut shortly after, leaving Alira alone with her racing thoughts and the strange, unfamiliar sensation of having finally, after 8 long years, spoken her truth aloud to the one person capable of determining her entire future. Outside, dawn had begun breaking over the pack grounds, the chaos of the previous night's conflict gradually giving way to the exhausted, uncertain calm that followed any significant battle. But within Alira's chest, an entirely different kind of storm continued churning, uncertain what the coming days might bring, now that her carefully guarded secret had finally, irreversibly come undone. The days following the attack brought a strange, uneasy adjustment for both Draven and Alira, each navigating the aftermath of the truth that had finally emerged between them, while simultaneously managing the ongoing consequences of the Thornwood clan's failed incursion. The rival pack had retreated beyond the eastern border following their defeat, but scouts continued reporting signs that they had not entirely abandoned their aggressive intentions toward Draven's territory. Word of Alira's sudden ability to speak had spread quickly through the pack, despite her hopes that the chaos of the attack might somehow contain the revelation. Warriors who had witnessed her urgent commands during the emergency treatment could not help but share the remarkable story, and within days, most of the pack had heard some version of the truth that had remained hidden for 8 years. Alira braced herself for judgment, for the same kind of dismissive cruelty she had witnessed directed toward her years earlier, when the elders first labeled her broken and unsuitable. Instead, she found the reaction among most pack members surprisingly understanding, even sympathetic, once the full context of her situation became known. Nora, once she had processed her own initial shock at discovering her longtime assistant's carefully guarded secret, offered nothing but quiet support, once Alira finally explained the fear that had driven her extraordinary deception. "I suspected something," Nora admitted during a quiet conversation several days after the attack, as the two women worked together preparing herbal supplies in the healer's hut. "Not the full truth, mind you, but something about your reactions occasionally struck me as too quick, too precise, for someone who genuinely could not follow spoken conversation. I simply never had reason to question it seriously enough to pursue the matter." "I am sorry for deceiving you specifically," Alira said, her voice still carrying some hesitation after so many years of careful silence. "You have been kind to me for nearly a decade, and I repaid that kindness with dishonesty." Nora shook her head gently. "You repaid my kindness with years of dedicated, skilled work that benefited this entire pack. Whatever fear drove your deception, I understand it well enough given the reputation our king carried during those years. I hold no resentment toward you for protecting yourself in the only way you found available." The acceptance offered some measure of comfort, though Alira remained deeply uncertain about her situation with Draven himself, who had not returned to the healer's hut since their initial confrontation on the night of the attack. She found herself wondering, during quiet moments throughout each day, exactly what conclusions he had reached during his period of reflection, and what those conclusions might mean for her future within the pack. Draven, for his part, spent those same days wrestling with a complicated tangle of emotions he had rarely experienced with such intensity throughout his years of leadership. The revelation of Alira's deception had initially stung with genuine hurt, a sense of having been fooled by someone he had begun to feel an inexplicable connection toward. But the longer he considered her explanation, the more that hurt gave way to a deeper, more uncomfortable reckoning with his own past behavior. He found himself revisiting memories from his years of territorial expansion with new, critical scrutiny, examining choices he had once considered necessary and justified through an entirely different lens. He remembered warriors who had served him faithfully, being dismissed without ceremony, once injuries or age reduced their usefulness. He remembered the calculated coldness he had cultivated deliberately, believing it necessary to project unshakable authority and discourage any challenge to his rule. He had built that reputation brick by brick, year by year, and it had served its intended purpose of discouraging rivals and consolidating his power across contested territories. But he had never considered, until now, exactly what that same reputation might cost him, in ways that had nothing to do with military strategy or political consolidation. A young woman had been so thoroughly terrified by the image he had cultivated that she chose to sacrifice her own voice for the better part of a decade rather than risk becoming bound to him. That realization sat uncomfortably in his chest, refusing to fully settle no matter how many times he examined it from different angles. He summoned Ronan for a private conversation several days into his reflection, seeking counsel from the one advisor who had served him long enough to offer honest perspective, rather than simple deference. "Do you believe I have been unnecessarily cruel throughout my years of leadership?" Draven asked directly, watching his advisor's expression carefully for genuine reaction rather than diplomatic evasion. Ronan considered the question seriously before answering. "You have been effective, my king, Territorial expansion and consolidation of power rarely happen through gentleness alone, but effectiveness and cruelty are not always the same thing, and I believe there have been moments throughout your rule where perhaps more mercy might have served your interests equally well, without sacrificing the authority you needed to maintain. The honest answer struck Draven with more weight than a simple reassurance would have provided, confirming the uncomfortable truths he had already begun recognizing within himself. I intend to change certain aspects of how I lead moving forward, Draven said finally, more to himself than to Ronan, though his advisor nodded in quiet approval at the declaration. That evening, Draven finally returned to the healer's hut, finding Alira alone, as Nora had already retired for the night. She looked up as he entered, her expression carefully guarded, though he could see genuine uncertainty beneath her practiced composure. "I have spent these past days reflecting on everything you told me," he said without preamble, choosing directness over the careful diplomatic language he might have once employed. "And I owe you an apology, not simply for whatever happened between us 8 years ago, but for the reputation that drove you to such extraordinary measures in the first place." Alira remained silent, watching him with cautious attention as he continued. "I built my authority through fear deliberately," he admitted, "and while that approach served certain necessary purposes throughout years of conflict and territorial expansion, I never fully considered what it might cost those within my own pack who deserved protection, rather than intimidation. You should never have felt forced to sacrifice your own voice, simply to avoid becoming bound to someone you believed capable of cruelty. I did not know you then," Alira said quietly, her voice growing steadier as the conversation continued. "I only knew the stories, the reputation that preceded you into every interaction." "I understand that now," Draven replied, "and I want to earn something different moving forward, if you are willing to allow it. Not through the same authority and expectation that shaped our first encounter, but through genuine trust, built carefully over time, rather than demanded through position or power." Alira studied his face for a long moment, searching for any hint of the calculated manipulation she might have expected from the ruthless Alpha King she had feared for so many years. Instead, she found only genuine, uncertain sincerity, a man attempting to reconcile with uncomfortable truths about his own past, while offering something she had never expected to receive. "What exactly are you proposing?" she asked carefully. Draven considered his words before answering. "I am not proposing an immediate bond, or any demand upon your future. I am proposing time. Time for you to know me as I actually am, rather than the reputation that preceded me. Time for us both to determine, honestly and without pressure, whether something genuine might exist between us, beyond the circumstances that first brought us together." The offer settled over Alira with unexpected weight, entirely different from anything she had imagined might follow the exposure of her long-guarded secret. She had spent 8 years bracing herself for punishment or forced compliance, never once considering that the truth might instead open a path towards something built on genuine choice, rather than fear or obligation. "I would be willing to consider that," she said finally, her voice carrying a cautious hope she had not allowed herself to feel in longer than she could remember. Draven's expression shifted slightly, something like genuine relief crossing his features at her response. "Then we begin there," he said, slowly and honestly, without the shadows of fear or deception that shaped everything before this moment. As they stood together in the quiet healer's hut, the weight of 8 years of careful secrecy finally beginning to lift, neither of them could have fully anticipated how quickly circumstances beyond their control would test this fragile new understanding, as the Thornwood clan's defeated forces began regrouping for one final, desperate attempt to claim the leverage they still believed existed, somewhere within Draven's territory. The renewed threat arrived faster than anyone within Draven's territory anticipated. Barely a week after his conversation with Alira in the quiet healer's hut, scouts reported a much larger Thornwood clan force massing near the eastern border, clearly determined to succeed where their earlier incursion had failed. This time, their intentions carried an added, more dangerous dimension, as intelligence suggested they now knew precisely where to search for the hidden connection to Draven's bloodline they believed could serve as valuable leverage. Someone within their ranks had learned about the events at the healer's hut, Ronan reported grimly, during an emergency meeting called "The Moment the Scouting Reports Arrived." "They know a woman connected to your line exists there, and they intend to use this attack specifically to capture her." Draven's blood ran cold at the report, every instinct immediately focused on ensuring Alira's safety above all other considerations. We move her to secure quarters within the central fortress immediately, he said without hesitation, his voice carrying the sharp, decisive authority that had made him such an effective leader throughout years of conflict. He personally oversaw her relocation that same evening, finding Alira at the healer's hut and explaining the situation with the same direct honesty that had characterized their recent conversations. They know about you specifically, he said, watching her expression carefully as the weight of the danger settled over her. I need you somewhere secure while we address this threat. Alira nodded, her expression tight with understandable fear, though she maintained the same steady composure that had impressed him throughout their growing acquaintance. What can I do to help? She asked, and the question surprised him, given the obvious danger she personally faced. You have already done more than you realize, Draven said, though he insisted on her relocation regardless, unwilling to risk her safety despite her evident willingness to contribute however possible to the pack's defense. The following 2 days brought intense preparation as Draven coordinated his forces to meet the approaching Thornwood clan threat with overwhelming strength, determined to end the conflict decisively rather than allowing continued uncertainty along his borders. He drew upon years of military experience, positioning his warriors strategically, while also implementing additional protective measures around the central fortress, where Alira now remained under careful guard. The Thornwood clan's attack, when it finally came, proved fierce, but ultimately unable to overcome the coordinated defense Draven had prepared. His forces met the invading warriors at the eastern border with disciplined precision, pushing back wave after wave of attacks throughout a long, difficult night of conflict. At the height of the battle, a small group of Thornwood warriors managed to break through the primary defensive line, moving with clear purpose toward the central fortress, rather than engaging with the main body of defenders. Draven, anticipating exactly this kind of desperate attempt, had positioned additional warriors specifically to intercept any breach targeting the fortress itself. The intercepting force met the infiltrating warriors just outside the fortress walls, and Draven himself joined the confrontation, determined to personally ensure no threat reached anywhere near Alira's secured location. The fighting proved brief but intense, Draven's superior strength and years of combat experience quickly overwhelming the smaller infiltrating group. By dawn, the Thornwood clan's forces had been decisively repelled, their leadership forced into a retreat that left little doubt about the futility of any future aggression toward Draven's territory. The threat that had loomed over the pack for weeks, finally, definitively resolved. Draven made his way to the central fortress immediately following the battle's conclusion, finding Alira waiting anxiously for news of the outcome. She rose quickly as he entered, her eyes searching his face for confirmation of what she desperately hoped to hear. It is over, he said simply, watching relief wash visibly across her features. The Thornwood clan has been decisively defeated. They will not threaten this territory again, for a long time to come. Alira released a shaky breath, some of the tension that had gripped her throughout the long, anxious night finally beginning to ease. And you? She asked, her eyes moving over him with obvious concern, searching for any sign of injury. I am unharmed, he assured her, though the exhaustion of the long battle showed clearly in his features. In the quiet aftermath of the conflict, as the pack began the slow process of recovery and celebration following their decisive victory, Draven and Alira found themselves alone in a moment of unexpected calm, the weight of shared danger and mutual relief, creating an intimacy neither of them had fully anticipated. I thought I might lose everything tonight, Draven admitted quietly, his usual careful composure giving way to genuine vulnerability now that the immediate crisis had passed. Not just the territory, or the pack's safety, but you as well, before we had even properly begun whatever this could become between us. Alira felt something warm settle in her chest at his words, a feeling entirely unfamiliar after 8 years of careful, guarded distance from genuine connection. I was afraid as well, she admitted, not just for my own safety, but for yours, throughout that entire long night. Draven studied her face for a long moment, something decisive forming behind his steady gaze. I do not wish to wait any longer to be honest about what I feel, he said finally. These past weeks, getting to know you, watching you find your voice again after so many years of silence, have shown me something I never expected to find. Not simply a mate assigned through circumstance or tradition, but someone whose strength and intelligence and courage I have come to genuinely admire. Alira's breath caught at the sincerity in his words, so different from the cold, calculating reputation she had feared for the better part of a decade. "I do not want to claim you through obligation or expectation," Draven continued, his voice carrying quiet, genuine emotion. "I want you to choose this, freely and completely, in a way you were never given the opportunity to choose 8 years ago." Tears gathered unexpectedly in Alira's eyes as she absorbed the full weight of his words, understanding now with complete clarity how far both of them had traveled from that first, fearful encounter nearly a decade earlier. "I choose this," she said, her voice steady and sure despite the emotion coloring her words, "not out of fear or obligation, but because these past weeks have shown me a man entirely different from the reputation I once feared, someone worth trusting, worth choosing, freely and completely." The moment that followed carried none of the fear or coercion that had shaped their original, aborted match all those years ago. Instead, it represented something built carefully and honestly, through genuine understanding rather than tradition or expectation, a bond formed through mutual respect and choice rather than obligation or fear. In the weeks that followed, as the pack celebrated their decisive victory over the Thornwood clan and settled back into peaceful routine, word spread throughout the territory of the remarkable story behind their king's chosen mate. The woman who had pretended to be mute for 8 years to escape a fate she once feared, only to find, when the truth finally emerged, that the man she had spent so long avoiding had transformed into someone entirely worth choosing freely. Alira continued her work at the healer's hut, now speaking freely and openly with the pack members she had served silently for so many years, her sharp intelligence and quick wit surprising many who had never known the true depth of the woman hidden behind her carefully maintained silence. Nora took particular pride in watching her longtime assistant finally step fully into the recognition and respect she had always deserved. Draven, for his part, continued reflecting on the lessons learned throughout this unexpected journey, working to reshape certain aspects of his leadership to balance necessary authority with the kind of genuine mercy and understanding that had been so notably absent during his years of ruthless territorial expansion. The reputation that had once driven a frightened young woman to sacrifice her own voice gradually transformed into something new, an authority built on respect rather than fear alone. Their bond, when it finally formed, carried none of the desperation or obligation that had characterized their first, aborted meeting 8 years earlier. Instead, it represented exactly what both of them had come to value most throughout their unexpected journey together, a connection built freely, honestly, and completely through genuine choice rather than circumstance or fear. The pack thrived under their combined leadership in the years that followed, Alira's wisdom and healing skills complementing Draven's strength and strategic mind, their partnership becoming a model of the kind of genuine, chosen bond that many throughout the territory had once believed impossible for an alpha king, known primarily for his ruthless conquests. And on quiet evenings, when the demands of leadership finally eased enough to allow reflection, both of them found themselves grateful for the strange, difficult path that had led them to this place, understanding fully now that the truth, however long delayed, had ultimately proven far stronger and more valuable than any fear or deception that had once kept them apart.